20 years. 20 years I've kept his memory alive in this house, even after he destroyed me. But today, David Thompson stood at my door again. The man who called me worthless because I couldn't give him children. Margaret, please. I need to talk to you. His voice was different, broken, desperate. The suitcase in his hand told me everything. Sarah had left him, just like he left me. Against every logical thought, I opened the door. My Christian heart wouldn't let me turn away a broken man. I am sick, Margaret. Cancer. And I have nowhere else to go. The irony wasn't lost on me. I remembered his cruel words from 20 years ago. You're not a real woman, Margaret. What good is a wife who can't have children? I need a woman who can give me a family, not someone broken like you. His words had shattered my world. But here he was, 20 years later, the broken one now. Life has a strange way of teaching lessons. I know I have no right to ask, but I was wrong, Margaret, about everything. Tears filled his tired eyes. I was just packing the attic, I said quietly. I'm selling the house, starting fresh at 52. As we climbed those creaky attic stairs, neither of us knew our lives were about to change forever. A sudden gust of wind from the attic window sent papers flying everywhere. Letters, dozens of them. David bent down and picked up one of the letters. His face went white as he read the header. Sunshine Adoption Agency. Margaret, these are all adoption applications. There must be 50 of them here. His voice trembled. My secret was out. 20 years of hidden dreams scattered across the dusty attic floor like broken promises. These dates, Margaret, you wrote these throughout our marriage. Even after I said no to adoption. His hands shook. I wrote one every year on our anniversary, the day I thought we'd become parents. But I never sent them because of you. David fell to his knees among the scattered letters, finally understanding the depth of sacrifice I'd made for our marriage. I could have been a mother, David. We could have been a family. But I chose you. I always chose you. Before we continue this incredible journey, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment below, give this video a thumbs up if it's touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories that prove love and forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. Now, let me tell you how this all began. It all began 27 years ago at St. Mary's Church in Nashville. I was 25, David was 27, and we believed in forever. Do you, Margaret Rose Williams, take David Thompson to be your lawfully wedded husband? Pastor Johnson's voice echoed through the chapel, filled with our families and friends. I looked into David's eyes and saw my entire future there. I do. I whispered, my voice trembling with joy and anticipation for the life we'd build together. The congregation erupted in applause as we kissed, sealing what we thought would be an unbreakable bond. Our wedding reception was everything we dreamed of. As we swayed to At Last by Etta James, David whispered in my ear, in 5 years, we'll have 3 little ones running around our feet at our anniversary dance. I laughed, pressing my cheek against his chest. Only 3? I was thinking more like 5. We were both teachers then. I taught elementary school. He taught high school history. We had modest salaries, but unlimited dreams of filling a house with children's laughter and bedtime stories. His mother, Eleanor, pulled me aside that night and said, "Welcome to the family, dear. I can't wait to spoil my grandchildren rotten." Everything felt perfect and destined. 6 months after our wedding, we bought our first home on Maple Street, a charming 2-story house with 4 bedrooms. 4 bedrooms, Margaret. That's room for at least 3 kids and a nursery, David said excitedly as we walked through the empty rooms, our footsteps echoing. I ran my hand along the banister of the staircase, imagining tiny hands gripping it as little feet climbed up and down. The master bedroom had a beautiful bay window where I envisioned a rocking chair for midnight feedings. We spent our first night there lying on the hardwood floor with just a blanket, planning which room would be the nursery and which would be the playroom. We were so full of hope and certainty that our dreams were just around the corner. Teaching 2nd grade at Hillcrest Elementary was more than a job. It was practice for motherhood. Every day, I was surrounded by 18 bright-eyed 7-year-olds who called me Mrs. Thompson and ran to hug me when they scraped their knees. "You're going to be such an amazing mother," my colleague Sarah Beth would say as she watched me tie shoelaces and wipe away tears. I had natural instincts with children that everyone noticed. During parent-teacher conferences, mothers would tell me, "You understand my child better than I do sometimes." I knew every student's favorite color, their fears, their dreams. At home, I'd tell David stories about their innocent questions and sweet gestures, both of us imagining our own children doing similar things. David was equally passionate about his calling. He taught American history at Davidson High School and had a gift for making the past come alive for teenagers. "Mr. Thompson makes history cool," his students would say. He'd come home energized, telling me about breakthrough moments when a struggling student finally understood the Civil War or the Great Depression. "I want to teach our kids about the world, Margaret." Real conversations around our dinner table about everything from ancient Rome to current events. He'd already picked out educational trips we'd take as a family. Washington, D.C., Colonial Williamsburg, the Gettysburg Battlefield. We both believed children were the greatest blessing God could give a couple, and we couldn't wait to receive ours. By our second year of marriage, we'd already prepared the nursery. We painted it soft yellow because we wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. David assembled a beautiful oak crib while I hung delicate white curtains with tiny stars. We'd purchased a rocking chair where I planned to nurse and sing lullabies. The changing table was stocked with diapers, the closet filled with tiny clothes from newborn to 12 months. Any day now, we'd whisper to each other as we stood in the doorway, admiring our handiwork. Friends and family began asking when we were going to fill that beautiful house with babies. We just smiled, confident it would happen in God's perfect timing. Month after month, the pregnancy tests came back negative. At first, we weren't worried. We were young, healthy, and had time. The Lord knows when we're ready, I'd tell myself, though a small knot of anxiety began forming in my stomach. David would find me staring at the negative tests and wrap his arms around me. "Don't worry, sweetheart. It'll happen when it's meant to happen." We started tracking ovulation, changing our diet, taking vitamins. I prayed constantly during my morning devotions, while walking the hallways at school, before bed every night. "Please, God, bless us with a child." The nursery door stayed closed more often as the months turned into years. After 3 years of trying, Dr. Matthews suggested fertility testing. "This is just routine," he assured us as we sat in his sterile office. "Most couples conceive within the first year, but everyone's timeline is different." The tests were invasive and emotionally exhausting. Blood work, ultrasounds, procedures that left me feeling like a specimen rather than a woman longing to be a mother. David held my hand through every appointment, his optimism never wavering. "We're going to figure this out, Margaret. Science has come so far." I clung to his confidence because my own was beginning to crack. The waiting rooms filled with other hopeful couples became a painful reminder of what we couldn't seem to achieve naturally. The day Dr. Matthews called us back for the results, I knew something was wrong by his expression. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but the tests show severe endometriosis that has caused significant scarring to your fallopian tubes, Margaret." The words hit me like a physical blow. "The damage is extensive. Natural conception would be highly unlikely." David's hand tightened around mine as the doctor continued explaining treatment options, but his voice sounded far away. All I could think about was the empty nursery at home, the dreams we'd carried for 5 years, the children I'd already named in my heart. "What are our chances?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Less than 5%, came the devastating reply. We sat in our car outside the doctor's office for an hour, both of us crying. "This doesn't change anything, Margaret," David whispered into my hair as I sobbed against his chest. "We'll find another way. There's adoption, there's IVF, there are miracles." But something inside me had broken that day. Not just my dreams, but my sense of wholeness as a woman. "I'm defective," I whispered. "No, you're not," David said firmly, lifting my chin to look at him. "You're perfect to me. We're going to get through this together, I promise." As we drove home past parks filled with children playing and mothers pushing strollers, I felt like I was watching a life I'd never be allowed to live. The nursery door would remain closed indefinitely. Dr. Matthews leaned forward in his leather chair, his expression gentle but grave. Margaret, David, I've reviewed all your test results multiple times. The endometriosis has caused extensive scarring throughout your reproductive system. His words felt like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples of devastation. The fallopian tubes are completely blocked, and there's significant damage to the ovarian tissue. I felt David's hands squeeze mine tighter as the reality began to sink in. This wasn't just a delay in our plans. This was the end of everything we dreamed about for 5 years of marriage. Are you saying we can never have children? The words came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Matthews adjusted his glasses, choosing his words carefully. Natural conception is virtually impossible. The scarring from endometriosis is extensive. We're talking about damage that occurred over many years, likely starting in your teens. I thought about all those painful periods I'd endured, thinking they were normal. All those months of hope, all those negative pregnancy tests suddenly made horrible sense. But there are other options, he continued quickly, seeing the devastation on my face. IVF, surrogacy, and of course adoption. But his voice seemed to come from very far away as my world crumbled around me. David's voice was steady but strained as he asked the questions I couldn't form. What exactly does this mean for Margaret's health? Is she in pain? Can the endometriosis be treated? Dr. Matthews explained that the condition could worsen over time, potentially requiring surgery. The priority now is managing Margaret's health and discussing your options for building a family. David nodded, ever the problem solver, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was already researching solutions while I was still processing the diagnosis. What are the success rates for IVF in cases like this? He pressed. With this level of damage, we'd be looking at less than 15% per cycle, and it would require multiple attempts. The numbers felt impossibly small. Walking out of that office felt surreal, like moving through thick fog. The hospital corridors seemed endless, filled with pregnant women and families with newborns. Everywhere I looked, life was celebrating what I couldn't have. David kept his arm around my shoulders, guiding me past the gift shop filled with "it's a boy" and "it's a girl" balloons. "We're going to be okay," he kept repeating, but I wasn't sure I believed him anymore. A young couple passed us, the woman's hand resting on her rounded belly, both of them glowing with anticipation. I had to stop and lean against the wall to catch my breath. 5 years of trying, 5 years of hope, and now this crushing finality. "Margaret, look at me." David turned in the driver's seat, his blue eyes intense with determination. "This doesn't change who we are or what we mean to each other. We're going to have a family, maybe just not the way we originally planned." I wanted to believe him, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. "I feel broken, David, like I'm not a real woman anymore." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Don't ever say that again," he said firmly, cupping my face in his hands. "You are the most complete woman I know. You're an incredible teacher. You have so much love to give, and you're going to be an amazing mother, one way or another." But even as he spoke, I could see something in his eyes had changed too. A flicker of doubt, maybe, or disappointment he was trying to hide. That night, I dove into research with desperate intensity. IVF success stories, endometriosis support groups, alternative treatments, anything that might offer hope. The statistics were sobering. Multiple cycles, hormone injections, emotional and financial strain, and still no guarantee of success. "Look at this," I called to David, pointing to a testimonial. This woman had 3 failed IVF cycles, but succeeded on the 4th. David sat beside me on the couch, reading over my shoulder. "That's encouraging," he said, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. The website estimated costs at $30,000 per cycle, not covered by insurance. We were teachers. Where we find that kind of money? Still, I bookmarked every success story, clinging to each glimmer of possibility. David spent the next day on the phone with our insurance company, our bank, and fertility clinics. "They consider it experimental," he reported after hanging up from the 3rd call. "Insurance won't cover any of it." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was stressed beyond his limit. "But we have some savings, and maybe we could take out a loan. I watched my practical, careful husband calculate risks and costs for something that had less than a 15% chance of working. David, that's our entire future. Our house payment, our retirement, everything. He looked at me with such fierce love. What's money compared to our dreams, Margaret? We'll figure it out. But even as he said it, I could see the weight of reality settling on his shoulders. I found myself standing in the doorway of our prepared nursery more and more often. The yellow walls we'd painted with such joy now seemed to mock our situation. The rocking chair sat empty, the crib unused, tiny clothes hanging in the closet with tags still attached. Maybe we should convert this room to something else, David suggested gently one evening, finding me there again. No, I said quickly, surprising myself with the intensity of my response. Not yet. This is still going to be our baby's room. He nodded, understanding that I wasn't ready to give up the physical manifestation of our dreams. But I could see him glancing at the room with growing sadness. It was becoming a shrine to our failure rather than a symbol of hope. My best friend Linda came over with coffee and tissues, having heard the news through our church prayer chain. "Honey, I know this feels like the end of the world, but God has a plan," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Maybe his plan for your motherhood looks different than you imagined." Linda was a nurse and had seen many couples face fertility struggles. "Have you considered adoption?" she asked gently. "There are so many children who need loving homes." The suggestion felt both hopeful and terrifying. "David wants to try IVF first," I admitted. "He's convinced we can still have a biological child." Linda nodded knowingly. "And what do you want?" It was a question I wasn't sure I could answer yet. That night, David held me close on our couch, both of us staring at the wall where we'd planned to hang family photos. "We're going to be okay. Margaret," he whispered into my hair. "This is just a detour, not the end of our journey." I wanted desperately to believe him, to recapture the certainty we'd once shared about our future. "Promise me something," I said, pulling back to look at him. "Promise me that no matter what happens, IVF, adoption, whatever path we take, we won't let this break us." His blue eyes were filled with unshed tears as he nodded. "I promise. We're stronger than this diagnosis. Our love is stronger than this." As we sat there in the growing darkness, neither of us could imagine how severely that promise would be tested in the years to come, or how the very issue meant to bring us closer would ultimately tear us apart. 3 years had passed since the diagnosis, and our marriage was slowly unraveling like a sweater with a pulled thread. David sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills, insurance rejection letters, and credit card statements. "Another failed IVF cycle," he muttered, throwing down a bill for $8,000. "That makes 3 attempts, Margaret. 3 failures." His voice carried a bitterness I'd never heard before. We'd spent our entire savings, borrowed against our house, and maxed out credit cards, chasing a dream that felt increasingly impossible. The doctor said some couples need 6 or 7 tries. I offered weakly, but even I was losing hope. David looked up at me with eyes that had lost their warmth. "We can't keep doing this, Margaret. We're destroying ourselves financially and emotionally." The man who once promised we'd figure everything out together was becoming a stranger, hardened by disappointment and crushed dreams. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing the same plate for the 3rd time, watching the neighbors' children play in their backyard through our window. The Johnsons had just welcomed their 2nd baby, and their 4-year-old was teaching his little sister to walk. "Look, Mommy, she did it," his excited voice carried through the glass. My chest tightened with familiar pain. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of what we couldn't have. At the grocery store, pregnant women. At church, baby dedications. Even at school, parent-teacher conferences where I watched families that came so naturally to everyone else. "Maybe we should move," I said suddenly, not turning around. David looked up from his papers. "What?" "Move somewhere we don't have to see children every day. Start fresh." The silence that followed told me he was considering it, which somehow made everything worse. Every day brought new reminders of our failure. Baby shower invitations, birth announcements, diaper ads in our mailbox. David would collect the mail with increasingly heavy shoulders, sorting through what felt like intentional torture from the universe. The Millers had their baby, he announced one evening, holding up a pink birth announcement. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Emma rose. I watched his face as he read the card, searching for any trace of the joy he used to show when friends had good news. Instead, there was only a tight smile and a quick placement of the card on what we'd come to call the pile. Announcements we couldn't bear to look at but felt guilty throwing away. That's wonderful for them, I managed, but the words felt hollow. We used to rush to buy baby gifts and visit new parents. Now we sent gift cards and made excuses about why we couldn't visit. In the quiet hours after David fell asleep, I began writing letters to adoption agencies. My handwriting was careful, hopeful, as I described our stable marriage, our love for children, our prepared nursery. Dear Sunshine Adoption Services, I would begin. My husband and I have been married for 8 years and have always dreamed of providing a loving home for a child in need. I researched agencies, read testimonials, and filled out preliminary applications online. The process seemed overwhelming but filled me with the first hope I'd felt in months. Children needed families, and we needed a child. It seemed like divine providence. But every time I mentioned adoption to David, his response was the same. Not yet, Margaret. I'm not ready to give up on having our own child. So I wrote the letters in secret, never sending them, storing them in a box under my desk. I saw you looking at adoption websites again, David said one evening, his voice edged with frustration. I'd forgotten to close my laptop, and the screen had been opened to a page about international adoption. David, maybe it's time we seriously considered it. There are so many children who need homes, and we have so much love to give. His jaw tightened in the way that meant his mind was made up. Those aren't our children, Margaret. I want our baby, with our genes, our features, our family history. I want to see my eyes in our child's face, or your smile. The conviction in his voice was absolute, but it felt like a rejection of every other child in the world. But what if IVF never works? What if we spend everything we have and still end up childless? He stood up, pacing to the window. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'm not giving up on our biological child yet. I found myself staying after Sunday service more and more often, sitting alone in the empty sanctuary asking God for guidance. Please show me the path forward, I whispered, staring up at the cross. I don't understand why this is happening to us. We'll be good parents. We have so much love to give. The silence felt deafening sometimes, as if even heaven had turned away from our prayers. Other days, I felt a gentle pull toward adoption, a sense that maybe God's plan looked different than our own. But how could I pursue that path when my husband was so firmly against it? Pastor Williams found me there one evening, tears streaming down my cheeks. Margaret, child, what's troubling your heart? He asked gently, sitting beside me in the pew. I feel like I'm being torn in two, Pastor, between what David wants and what my heart is telling me might be right. David threw himself into his work with an intensity that worried me. He stayed late at school, grading papers that could wait, organized his classroom obsessively, and volunteered for every committee and extra duty available. I need to stay busy, he explained when I asked about his 14-hour days. It keeps my mind off everything. But I could see what he was really doing, avoiding our house, avoiding me, avoiding the conversations we needed to have about our future. His students noticed the change too. Where he'd once been patient and encouraging, he became strict and demanding. Mr. Thompson used to be fun. I overheard a student tell their parent at a school event. Now he just seems angry all the time. When I mentioned this to David, he brushed it off. I'm fine, Margaret. I'm just focused on things I can actually control. But control was exactly what we'd lost, and his attempts to find it elsewhere were pulling us further apart. Simple errands became exercises in emotional endurance. The grocery store baby aisle, the children's clothing section at department stores, even commercials on television felt like personal attacks. I'd find myself standing in Target, staring at tiny shoes and blankets, imagining the child who might wear them. Can I help you find anything? A young sales associate asked, her name tag reading Ashley with a small stroller pin that announced she was expecting. No, thank you, I managed, quickly walking away before she could see the tears starting to form. David stopped coming shopping with me. After too many trips ended with me crying in the car. Just make a list, he'd say, handing me his wallet. I'll wait here. We were both protecting ourselves, but we were also isolating from each other in ways that would have been unimaginable during our early years of marriage. Our conversations became shorter, more practical, devoid of the dreams and plans that used to fill our evenings. How was your day? Fine. What do you want for dinner? Doesn't matter. The comfortable silences we used to share turned into awkward gaps filled with unspoken resentment and disappointment. We still said, "I love you" before bed, but the words felt like a habit rather than a declaration. I caught David staring at me, sometimes with an expression I couldn't read. Was it sadness? Frustration? Regret? When our eyes met, he'd quickly look away, and I wondered if he was thinking the same thing I was, that maybe we were fighting so hard for a future together that we were destroying our present. The nursery door stayed closed, but its presence haunted us both like a ghost of the family we couldn't create. I started keeping a journal, pouring out all the thoughts and feelings I couldn't share with David anymore. Year 8, I wrote one night. 3 failed IVF attempts. Credit cards maxed out. Marriage hanging by a thread. I love my husband, but I don't recognize us anymore. We used to laugh together, dream together, support each other through anything. Now we're like 2 people drowning who are too exhausted to save each other. I wrote about my secret adoption research, my growing certainty that there was another path to parenthood if only David would consider it. I see children at school every day who would thrive with our love and stability. But David can't see past his need for a biological connection. I understand it, but I also think we're missing something beautiful while chasing something that may never happen. I hid the journal like I hid everything else. My hopes, my research, my growing sense that our marriage was becoming a casualty of our unfulfilled dreams. It started innocently enough. David mentioned Sarah Mitchell from his new job at the downtown educational consulting firm almost casually. There's this woman at work, Sarah. She's brilliant, has all these innovative ideas about curriculum development. He'd taken a corporate job after we'd maxed out our teaching salaries trying to fund IVF treatments. Sarah was young, ambitious, and everything I felt I wasn't anymore. She's only 28, but she's already making waves in the company, David continued, not noticing how my stomach clenched. The CEO thinks she's destined for big things. I forced a smile, but something about the way he said her name, with a lightness that had been missing from his voice for years, made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar fear. David started working late more frequently, citing important projects and deadlines. Sarah and I are working on this presentation for the board, became his standard explanation for missed dinners and weekend work sessions. I'd set the table for 2 and end up eating alone, reheating his plate and leaving it wrapped in foil. Our conversations, already strained by years of fertility struggles, became even more sparse. When he did come home, he seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen since our early marriage. But that energy wasn't directed toward me. He'd talk animatedly about work challenges, strategic plans, and always, somehow, Sarah's contributions to their success. You should meet her sometime, he suggested one evening. I think you'd really like her. The irony of that suggestion would haunt me later. I began noticing small changes in David's behavior. He'd step outside to take certain phone calls, saying they were work-related, but speaking in hushed tones that seemed inappropriate for business discussions. His phone, which used to lay carelessly around the house, was now always in his pocket or face down on surfaces. Sorry, work emergency, he'd say, grabbing it quickly when it buzzed during dinner. One evening, I heard him laughing, actually laughing, during one of these work calls in his office. The sound was jarring because I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard him laugh that way with me. When I asked about it later, he was vague. Oh, Sarah was just telling me about this funny thing that happened in her meeting today. The casual intimacy in his explanation felt like a slap. I became a person I never thought I'd be, suspicious, searching, desperate for evidence of what I already knew in my heart. One evening while David was in the shower, I saw his phone light up with a text message. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Today was amazing. Smiling face with smiling eyes. The emoji felt like a knife in my chest. My hand shook as I quickly set the phone back down, my mind racing. There could be innocent explanations. Maybe they'd had a successful presentation. Maybe it was purely professional excitement. But the flutter of hearts I felt in my stomach told me otherwise. That night, I lay awake listening to David's breathing, wondering when my husband had become a stranger and when I'd become the kind of wife who checked her husband's phone. The truth became undeniable when I decided to surprise David at his office one Friday evening. I made his favorite dinner and thought maybe we could recapture some intimacy we'd lost. I saw you with her tonight. The words came out steadier than I felt as David walked through our front door at nearly midnight. He froze, his keys still in his hand, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, guilt, and finally, resignation. Margaret, I can explain. But his voice lacked conviction, and we both knew there was no explanation that would make this right. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 37 years. 3 months, he admitted, not meeting my eyes. But it's not what you think. It's not just physical. She makes me feel like myself again, like the man I used to be before all of this. His gesture encompassed our house, our struggles, our failed dreams, and by extension me. You don't understand what it's like, Margaret. David's voice rose as he began pacing our living room like a caged animal. Every day I come home to this house filled with reminders of what we can't have. The closed nursery door, your sad eyes, the bills from doctors who keep taking our money but can't give us what we want. Sarah doesn't look at me like I'm broken. She doesn't make me feel like a failure as a man. His words hit me like physical blows. So this is my fault. I managed. I'm the reason you're having an affair. He stopped pacing, running his hands through his hair. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that with her. I remember who I used to be. I remember what it felt like to have hope, to plan for the future, to believe that good things could happen. The cruelest part was that I understood exactly what he meant. She's pregnant, isn't she? The question came from somewhere deep inside me. A certainty I hadn't known I possessed. David's face went white, and his silence was answer enough. 8 weeks, he whispered finally. We didn't plan it. It just happened. The irony was so cruel, it almost made me laugh. The man who'd spent years insisting we could only be parents to a biological child, who'd rejected adoption because he needed to see his own features reflected back at him, had effortlessly created life with another woman. She can give you what I can't, I said. And it wasn't a question. David looked at me with something that might have been pity. Margaret, you have to understand, this changes everything. I'm going to be a father. I'm finally going to have the family I've always wanted. The family he'd always wanted. Not the family we dreamed of together, but the family he could have without me. I want a divorce, Margaret. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally consumed everything we'd built together. I'm sorry, but I can't keep pretending this marriage can survive what we've been through. Sarah and we're going to get married after the baby comes. I stared at him. This man I'd loved for 12 years, trying to reconcile the David who'd once promised to love me in sickness and in health with a stranger who was abandoning me for a younger, fertile woman. You're leaving me because I can't have children, I said, needing to hear him acknowledge the truth. He had the decency to look ashamed. I'm leaving because we're not the same people we were when we got married. This struggle has changed us both, and I need to be honest about what I want. I want children, Margaret, biological children, and I want them with someone who can give them to me without years of heartbreak and failure. After David packed his bags and left for Sarah's apartment, I sat in our living room until sunrise, processing the destruction of everything I'd thought was permanent in my life. 12 years of marriage gone. The man who'd once called me his soulmate had discarded me like a defective appliance that couldn't perform its intended function. The cruelest part wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that he was right about some things. We had become different people, strangers who shared a house and a history, but no longer shared dreams. But where I'd seen our struggles as something to overcome together, he'd seen them as evidence that we were fundamentally incompatible. As the sun came up over our quiet neighborhood, I understood that David hadn't just left me for another woman. He'd left me for the possibility of becoming the father he'd always dreamed of being. And I was left to figure out who Margaret Thompson was when she wasn't half of a couple desperately trying to create life together. The silence in our house after David left was deafening. Every room echoed with memories of the life we'd built together. The kitchen where we'd planned our future over morning coffee. The living room where we'd held each other through failed pregnancy tests. The closed nursery door that now seemed to mock my solitude. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, touching furniture and photographs, trying to make sense of how 12 years of marriage could end so abruptly. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter, David's signature already dry while mine remained blank. Irreconcilable differences. The legal language read, as if our inability to have children together was just a minor incompatibility rather than the earthquake that had split our foundation in two. I couldn't bring myself to sign them yet, though we both knew it was inevitable. Linda found me 3 days after David left, still in the same clothes I'd worn to confront him, having barely eaten or slept. "Oh, honey," she whispered, gathering me into her arms on my front porch. "I heard about David and Sarah. I'm so sorry." The kindness in her voice broke something loose inside me, and I sobbed against her shoulder for what felt like hours. "I don't know how to be alone, Linda. For 12 years, I've been David's wife, and before that, I was preparing to be David's wife. I don't know who Margaret is without him." Linda held me tighter. "Then this is your chance to find out, sweetie. And I have a feeling she's going to be more amazing than you can imagine right now." But her optimism felt impossible to believe when I couldn't even manage to shower or eat a full meal. Pastor Williams insisted on weekly counseling sessions, though I initially resisted. "I'm not sure my faith can handle this, Pastor," I admitted during our first meeting. I prayed for years for a child, for my marriage to survive, for David to love me enough to stay. Where was God in all of that? Pastor Williams leaned forward, his kind eyes full of understanding. "Margaret, I've seen many couples struggle with infertility, and I've watched it either strengthen marriages or destroy them. Your pain is real, and your anger at God is understandable. But I don't believe he's abandoned you." I laughed bitterly. "Then why do I feel so completely alone?" "Because," he said gently, "sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we needed in order to discover what we actually need. Your identity isn't dependent on being a wife or mother. You are beloved by God exactly as you are." Returning to teaching was both salvation and torture. The children in my third-grade classroom needed me in ways that felt both familiar and foreign. "Mrs. Thompson, are you okay?" 8-year-old Emma asked one morning, noticing tears I try to hide. "You seem sad." Children have an uncanny ability to see through adult pretenses. "I'm a little sad, Emma, but being here with all of you makes me feel better." And it was true. When I was explaining fractions, or reading stories aloud, or helping tie shoes, I remembered why I'd chosen teaching in the first place. These children needed love, guidance, and stability, things I had to give even if I couldn't give them to children of my own. "Maybe you could be my extra mom," Emma suggested innocently. "I have one at home, but everyone needs extra love." Her words stayed with me long after the school day ended. In the quiet evenings alone, I returned to the adoption research I'd abandoned during my marriage. Without David's resistance, I could finally explore the possibility that had tugged at my heart for years. I spread brochures across my kitchen table: domestic adoption, international adoption, fostering to adopt. "Dear Adoption Agency," I wrote carefully, "I'm a recently divorced teacher who has always dreamed of providing a loving home for a child in need." The words felt different now, more honest somehow. I wasn't writing as half of a couple trying to fulfill a biological imperative. I was writing as a woman who had loved to give and room in her life for a child who needed both. For the first time in years, writing these letters didn't feel like a compromise or a consolation prize. It felt like a calling I was finally free to answer. Cleaning out our house became a form of therapy. Each box I packed contained memories of the life David and I had built together: wedding photos, Christmas decorations, the baby books we'd collected over the years. I found myself keeping some things and releasing others, slowly disentangling my identity from our shared history. In the attic, I discovered all the adoption letters I'd written over the years, carefully stored in a shoebox like pressed flowers. 23 letters to various agencies, dating back to our 3rd year of marriage. I could have been a mother years ago, I whispered to myself, reading through the carefully crafted applications. But then I realized something profound. Maybe this was the right timing. Maybe I needed to lose David to find the courage to pursue motherhood on my own terms. My relationship with God slowly began to heal as I spent more time in prayer and less time bargaining for things I couldn't control. I don't understand your plan, I would whisper during evening prayers, but I'm trying to trust that you know what you're doing. The anger I'd carried for years began to soften into something more like acceptance. Maybe my path to motherhood was supposed to look different than I'd imagined. Maybe there was a child somewhere who needed exactly what I had to offer. Not a perfect 2-parent home with biological connections, but a single mother with an enormous capacity for love and a deep understanding of what it meant to long for family. The thought filled me with a peace I hadn't experienced since before our fertility struggles began. I think I want to adopt, I told Linda over coffee 6 months after David left. Not as a consolation prize or a second choice, but because I genuinely believe there's a child out there who's meant to be my son or daughter. Linda's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since my divorce. Margaret, that's wonderful. What changed your mind? I thought about it carefully. I realized I was so focused on creating life that I forgot about nurturing the life that already exists. There are children who need homes, who need love, who need someone to believe in them. Maybe my infertility wasn't a curse. Maybe it was redirecting me toward a child who was always meant to be mine. Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. David was an idiot to leave you. You're going to be an incredible mother. The day I mailed my first official adoption application felt like the first day of my real life. Standing at the post office counter, holding the thick envelope containing my home study request, financial statements, and heartfelt letter of intent, I felt a mixture of terror and excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Express mail? The postal clerk asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. This is the most important letter I've ever sent. As I watched the envelope disappear into the mail system, I whispered a prayer. God, if there's a child out there who's meant to be mine, please help us find each other. For the first time since David left, I felt like I was moving towards something beautiful instead of running away from something broken. The wait would be long and uncertain, but I was finally on a path that felt authentically mine. 1 year after David left, I finally opened the nursery door, not to grieve what never was, but to prepare for what could be. I repainted the walls a soft sage green, hung new curtains with whimsical animals, and arranged the furniture with fresh hope. The rocking chair where I'd once imagined nursing my biological child now sat ready to comfort an adopted son or daughter who would need extra security and love. As I hung a mobile of colorful butterflies above the crib, I realized this room had always been waiting for the right child, not necessarily the child David and I would have created together, but the child who would choose our family through adoption. Soon, I whispered to the empty room. Soon you'll have someone to love in here. The adoption agency had called that morning to say they had several potential matches to discuss. After years of closed doors, new ones were finally opening, leading me toward the motherhood I was always meant to experience. Meanwhile, David's new life with Sarah seemed picture-perfect from the outside. They'd married 6 months after our divorce was finalized, and Sarah had given birth to a healthy baby boy they named Michael. 2 years later, their daughter Emma arrived. David finally had the biological family he'd always dreamed of, 2 beautiful children with his eyes and Sarah's golden hair. Their Christmas cards showed a glowing family of 4 in matching sweaters, standing in front of their new 2-story colonial house in the affluent suburbs. Life is good, David would tell his colleagues at work. I have everything I ever wanted. But even as he spoke those words, something hollow echoed in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. Success in business, a beautiful wife, 2 healthy children. So why did he sometimes find himself staring out his office window, thinking about the quiet house on Maple Street and the woman he'd left behind? Sarah had adapted quickly to their increased income from David's corporate success. Where I had been content with simple pleasures, a good book, a home-cooked meal, quiet evenings together, Sarah craved constant stimulation and acquisition. David, I saw the most amazing handbag at Nordstrom today, became a regular refrain. Their credit card bills reflected her expensive tastes: designer clothes, luxury vacations, the latest gadgets, and home decor. "We can afford it," she'd argue when David questioned their mounting debt. "You're making good money now, and we deserve to enjoy it." But David remembered the contentment he'd once felt in our modest teacher's home, where happiness came from connection rather than consumption. He'd traded emotional intimacy for material prosperity, and some days the exchange felt like a poor bargain. By their 5th year of marriage, David's dream life was showing serious cracks. Sarah's spending had outpaced even his substantial salary, and they were drowning in debt despite their affluent appearance. "How did we spend $12,000 last month?" David asked, staring at their credit card statement. Sarah shrugged, bouncing baby Emma on her hip. "I don't know, just normal stuff. The kids need things. I need clothes for work events. The house needs updating." But David knew better. It was the constant pursuit of more, bigger, better that had them leveraged to the breaking point. He worked longer hours trying to keep up with Sarah's expectations, missing bedtime stories and family dinners. The children barely knew him, and Sarah seemed more like a business partner than a wife. Late at night, he'd find himself wondering if Margaret ever thought about him, if she'd found the happiness that seemed to elude him despite having everything he thought he wanted. The children David had so desperately wanted were growing up without the guidance he'd imagined providing them. Michael, now 7, was aggressive and demanding, used to getting whatever he wanted through tantrums and manipulation. 5-year-old Emma was sweet but clingy, competing for attention in a household where both parents were often distracted. "Daddy, will you read to me?" Emma would ask, but David was usually on his laptop, trying to manage the financial crisis their lifestyle had created. "Not now, princess. Daddy has work to do." Sarah was equally unavailable, either shopping, on the phone with friends, or planning their next expensive vacation. The house was filled with toys and gadgets, but it lacked the warmth and intentionality David remembered from his own childhood. He'd wanted to raise children who were grounded, grateful, and kind. Instead, he was raising children who expected everything and appreciated nothing. "We need to talk about our spending, Sarah," David said one evening, spreadsheets covering their kitchen table. "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage, our credit cards are maxed out, and we owe more than the house is worth." Sarah's response was predictably dismissive. "So we'll refinance again, or you'll get another promotion. You're always so negative, David." But her cavalier attitude toward their financial destruction terrified him. "This isn't negativity, it's reality. We're living beyond our means, and it's going to destroy us." Sarah rolled her eyes, gathering her purse to leave. "I'm going to my sister's. Maybe she'll be more fun than you tonight." As she slammed the door, David sat alone in their expensive kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and stainless steel appliances they couldn't afford, wondering how he'd traded the authentic love he'd had with Margaret for this hollow performance of success. The final blow came when David discovered Sarah had been hiding credit cards and loans he didn't know about. $60,000 in secret debt. He asked the divorce attorney, his voice barely above a whisper. "How was that possible?" "Your wife has been very creative with applications, using your income to qualify for credit you never knew existed," the lawyer explained matter-of-factly. "She's also been seeing someone else for the past 6 months. David felt the ground shift beneath him exactly as it had 20 years earlier when he'd learned about my infertility, except this time, he was the one being abandoned. "She wants half of everything in the divorce, plus alimony and child support," the attorney continued. "Given your income and the fact that she's been the primary caregiver, she'll likely get it." David realized he was about to lose his children, his home, and his financial future to a woman who'd never loved him the way Margaret had, completely, sacrificially, without condition. "Mommy, don't go," Emma cried as Sarah packed her suitcases with military efficiency. "I'm not going anywhere, baby." Mommy's taking you and Michael to live in a nice new apartment with Uncle Kevin. David's stomach dropped. Uncle Kevin was Sarah's yoga instructor, 25 years old, unmarried, and clearly not interested in being a stepfather to two traumatized children. Sarah, please don't do this to them. They need stability right now. But Sarah was beyond reasoning. What they need is a mother who's happy, not one who's trapped in a marriage with a man who can't provide the life we deserve. The irony was crushing. David had left me because I couldn't give him children, and now Sarah was taking his children away because he couldn't give her enough money. As he watched his son and daughter being loaded into Sarah's SUV, he understood for the first time the depth of pain he'd caused me when he'd abandoned our marriage for the promise of something better. The house felt cavernous after Sarah took the children and most of the furniture. David walked through rooms that had never felt like home, surrounded by the remnants of a life built on shallow foundations. In the master bedroom, he found a photo that had fallen behind the dresser, our wedding picture, somehow mixed in with Sarah's things and forgotten. Looking at our young faces, so full of hope and certainty, he felt a grief deeper than anything he'd experienced. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. Margaret's eyes looked back at him from the photograph, trusting and full of love, the kind of love that would have weathered any storm, forgiven any mistake, and chosen commitment over convenience every single time. He'd traded the real thing for a prettier package, and now he had neither. As if losing his family wasn't enough, David's world collapsed completely when routine blood work revealed elevated PSA levels. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but the biopsy confirms our suspicions. You have aggressive prostate cancer that's already begun to spread." Dr. Martinez's voice seemed to come from very far away. "We'll need to start treatment immediately. Surgery, followed by radiation and possibly chemotherapy." David stared at the test results, processing the reality that he was facing his mortality alone. No wife to hold his hand through treatment, no daily contact with his children to motivate his fight, no family gathered around him for support. Sarah had already made it clear that his health problems were not her responsibility anymore. In that sterile examination room, David finally understood what Margaret must have felt when her body betrayed her dreams, the profound isolation that comes with facing your worst fears without the person who promised to love you in sickness and in health. During his cancer treatment, confined to bed rest and nausea, David had nothing but time to think about the choices that had brought him to this place. He pulled out old photo albums, studying pictures of Margaret and himself during happier times, teaching together, traveling on modest vacations, hosting friends for dinner in our tiny kitchen. She would have stayed, he realized with crystalline clarity. She would have held my hand through every treatment, driven me to every appointment, and never once complained about the burden. Margaret's love had been unconditional in ways Sarah's never was. Where Sarah had abandoned him the moment their lifestyle became inconvenient, Margaret had clung to their marriage through years of disappointment and heartbreak. "I threw away the only woman who ever really loved me," he admitted to his reflection in the darkened window. "And for what? Children who barely know me and a wife who left the moment things got difficult." The cancer was eating away at his body, but the regret was consuming his soul. During one of my sleepless nights battling cancer, I found myself searching for Margaret online, something I'd resisted doing for 20 years. What I discovered made my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and profound regret. Local teacher wins state award for excellence in education. Read a newspaper headline from 3 years ago. There was Margaret, older but still beautiful, accepting an award for her innovative literacy program. The article mentioned how she dedicated her career to nurturing children who needed extra support and love. Even without me, she'd found ways to mother countless children through her teaching. Margaret Thompson has touched the lives of over 400 students during her career. The principal was quoted saying, "She has this incredible ability to see potential in every child and help them believe in themselves." Reading those words, I realized Margaret had become exactly the kind of person I'd once hoped to become, someone who made the world better simply by existing in it. Another search revealed that Margaret had started a nonprofit organization called Every Child Deserves Love, which provided school supplies and mentoring to children in foster care. The website showed photos of her reading to kids, helping with homework, and organizing donation drives. In every picture, her face glowed with the same joy I remembered from our early days together. But now it seemed deeper, more grounded. She'd found her calling in ways that had nothing to do with having biological children. Our mission is simple, her bio read. Every child deserves to feel valued, supported, and loved, regardless of their circumstances. I stared at her photo for a long time, seeing the woman I'd abandoned transformed into someone even more remarkable than the person I'd fallen in love with 27 years ago. She'd taken her pain and turned it into purpose, her loss into service for others. During my chemotherapy sessions, surrounded by other cancer patients and their devoted spouses, I was constantly reminded of what I'd thrown away. "Honey, do you need another pillow?" I'd hear wives ask their sick husbands. "Let me get the nurse. You're due for pain medication." I watched elderly couples who'd clearly weathered decades together, still holding hands while facing the ultimate test of their wedding vows. One woman, probably in her 70s, never missed a single treatment with her husband. 52 years married next month, she told me proudly. Through good times and bad, just like we promised. Her devotion made me think of Margaret's unwavering faith during our fertility struggles. She would have been here with me, I knew without a doubt. She would have researched every treatment option, organized my medications, and held my hand through every scary moment. Instead, I sat alone, paying strangers to drive me to appointments because I had no one else to call. The hardest part of being sick wasn't the physical pain. It was the emotional isolation, especially from Michael and Emma. "I'm sorry, but the children are busy right now," Sarah would say whenever I called, her voice cold and dismissive. "Maybe try again next week." When I did manage to speak with them, our conversations were stilted and brief. "Hi, Dad," Michael would say, sounding distracted. "Mom says you're sick. Are you going to die?" His matter-of-fact tone broke my heart. These children, who I'd left Margaret to have, barely knew me as anything more than the man who sent support checks. "I love you, buddy," I'd tell him, but the words fell hollow across the distance I'd created. "Okay, can I go play now?" Meanwhile, I knew Margaret was probably still getting handmade cards and daily hugs from former students who remembered how much she cared about them. I'd gained biological children, but lost the capacity for the kind of deep, nurturing love that creates real family bonds. After my surgery, during a particularly low moment in recovery, I found myself driving past our old house on Maple Street. I parked across the street, studying the home where Margaret and I had built our life together. The garden was beautifully maintained, the porch decorated with seasonal flowers, and there were wind chimes that caught the afternoon breeze. It looked like a place where someone was genuinely happy, content with the life they created. I noticed a small sign by the front door. "Every child deserves love, donations welcome." Even from her own home, Margaret was continuing her mission to help children in need. I sat in my car for over an hour, working up the courage to knock on the door, but ultimately driving away. What right did I have to disrupt the peace she'd clearly found? What could I possibly offer her except apologies that were 20 years too late? That night, I started writing Margaret a letter, not to send, just to process the overwhelming guilt and regret that was consuming me. "Dear Margaret," I began, my handwriting shaky from the cancer treatments. "I don't expect you to ever forgive me, and I have no right to ask for your understanding, but I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my entire life." I wrote about Sarah's departure, about the children who barely knew me, about facing cancer alone. "You would have stayed," I wrote, tears blurring my vision. "Through sickness and health, for better or worse. You understood what those vows meant in ways I never did. I threw away the most precious gift God ever gave me because I was too selfish and short-sighted to see what I had." The letter grew to 10 pages of regret, gratitude, and desperate longing for forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. I sealed it in an envelope, but kept it in my desk drawer, too ashamed to send it. 6 months into treatment, Dr. Martinez delivered unexpected news. Your latest scans show significant improvement, David. The tumors are shrinking faster than we anticipated, and your PSA levels are dropping. I should have felt pure relief, but instead I felt something more complex. Gratitude mixed with a strange sense of purpose. You're going to beat this, he continued. With continued treatment and monitoring, you should have many good years ahead of you. As I walked out of the oncology center, I realized that surviving cancer meant I had a chance to make different choices, to become the man I should have been all along. But first, I needed to face the person I'd hurt most deeply and somehow try to make amends, even if forgiveness was impossible. Margaret deserved to know that her love hadn't been wasted on someone incapable of growth or gratitude. The decision to see Margaret came suddenly one October morning as I was recovering from my final round of chemotherapy. I'd been cancer-free for 3 months, and while my body was still weak, my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I showered carefully, put on a clean shirt, and practiced what I might say to her. Margaret, I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I need to tell you how sorry I am. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. I wasn't going to her house to ask for reconciliation. That ship had sailed 20 years ago. I was going to offer something I should have given her decades earlier. Acknowledgement of her worth, appreciation for her love, and genuine remorse for the pain I'd caused. She deserved to hear those things, even if hearing them brought her no comfort. As I drove toward Maple Street with my small suitcase in the back seat, I thought about all the ways this conversation could go. Margaret might slam the door in my face, and I would deserve that reaction. She might listen politely and then ask me to leave, which would also be her right. Or she might, in the grace that had always defined her character, allow me to apologize fully and find some measure of peace. I wasn't expecting forgiveness. That would be too much to hope for after what I'd done. But I needed her to know that her love hadn't been squandered on someone incapable of recognizing its value. 20 years of regret had taught me exactly how precious Margaret Thompson was, and while I couldn't undo the past, I could at least honor her with the truth about what her love had meant to me. Standing at Margaret's front door after 20 years felt surreal. The doorbell was the same one we'd chosen together at Home Depot during our second year of marriage. The porch still had the swing where we'd sat on summer evenings, planning our future and dreaming about the children who would play in our yard. Now I was here as a stranger, a broken man seeking forgiveness from the woman whose heart I'd shattered. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorbell, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether I'd spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of my mistakes alone, or whether Margaret's grace might offer me a path toward redemption I'd never dared to hope for. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the button and waited to face the consequences of every choice I'd made since the day I walked away from the most authentic love I'd ever known. The doorbell rang just as I was taping up another box in the living room. I wasn't expecting anyone. Linda was at work, and the moving truck wasn't scheduled until next week. When I opened the door and saw David standing there, 20 years older and visibly frail, holding a small suitcase, I thought I might be hallucinating. "Hello, Margaret," he said softly, his voice hoarse and uncertain. For a moment, neither of us moved. He looked so different, thinner, grayer, with lines around his eyes that spoke of suffering I couldn't imagine. But those blue eyes were still the same ones I'd fallen in love with 27 years ago. "David," I whispered, my hand still gripping the doorframe. "What are you doing here?" The question came out more gently than I'd intended, but 20 years of Christian growth had softened my capacity for anger, even toward the man who'd broken my heart so completely. "I know I have no right to be here," David began, his voice trembling with emotion. "And I know you have every reason to close this door in my face. But Margaret, I'm sick. I have cancer, and Sarah, she left me, took the kids, took everything, and moved in with another man." His words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid I'd stop him before he could explain. "I'm getting better. The treatments worked, but I realized I couldn't move forward with my life without telling you how sorry I am. How deeply, profoundly sorry I am for what I did to you." I studied his face, seeing genuine remorse where once there had been only selfish determination. I don't have anywhere else to go, he admitted, looking down at his suitcase. But more than that, I needed to see you, to tell you that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my entire life. Every instinct told me to protect myself, to close the door and preserve the peace I'd worked so hard to build. But looking at this broken man on my doorstep, the same man who'd once promised to love me forever, I felt something I didn't expect: compassion. Not romantic love that had been buried long ago, but the kind of Christian mercy that compels you to help someone in need, even someone who'd hurt you deeply. "You look terrible," I said finally, and despite everything, a small smile played at his lips. "I feel terrible," he admitted, "in every way possible." I stepped back from the door, my hand moving almost involuntarily to gesture him inside. "Come in. You shouldn't be standing on the porch in your condition." As he crossed the threshold of our former home, I whispered a quick prayer for wisdom, strength, and protection of my heart. David's eyes swept across our living room, taking in the boxes stacked everywhere and the bare walls where our wedding photos had once hung. "You're really selling the house," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This place holds so many memories." I busied myself clearing space on the couch, needing something to do with my hands. 20 years of memories, I agreed carefully. But it's time for a fresh start. I'm buying a small condo closer to the school. He nodded slowly, running his fingers along the mantel where we'd once displayed Christmas stockings for the children we'd never had. "Margaret, I need you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't regretted leaving you. Not one single day." His honesty was both healing and painful, like cleaning a wound that had never properly healed. "Tell me about the cancer," I said, settling into the chair across from him. Not the couch where we might sit too close together. David's hands shook slightly as he explained the diagnosis, the treatments, the months of facing mortality alone. Sarah couldn't handle it. The moment the medical bills started piling up and I couldn't work full-time, she was done. Said she didn't sign up to be a caregiver to a sick old man. His laugh was bitter, but not entirely without humor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I left you because you were broken, and she left me for exactly the same reason. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, not for what we'd lost, but for the suffering he'd endured. "I'm sorry you went through that alone," I said quietly. "No one should face cancer without support." His eyes filled with tears at my simple expression of compassion. That's when the wind from the attic window above us sent the papers flying down, dozens of adoption letters I'd written over the years, scattered across our living room like confetti of broken dreams. David instinctively reached for them, his eyes widening as he read the letterheads. Sunshine Adoption Services, Hope for Children Agency, Forever Families. His voice grew quieter with each one. "Margaret, what are these?" I felt heat rise to my cheeks, as if I'd been caught in some shameful secret. "They're adoption applications," I said simply. "I wrote them throughout our marriage. Every year on our anniversary, actually, but I never sent them because you didn't want to adopt." David's hands trembled as he picked up letter after letter, reading dates that spanned our entire relationship. "My God, Margaret," David whispered, holding up a letter dated just 3 years into our marriage. "You wrote this when we were still trying IVF. You wanted to adopt even then." He kept reading, his face growing paler with each letter. "Loving home for child in need. Stable marriage. Both teachers who adore children." His voice broke as he read my words aloud. "You described us as the perfect adoptive family. We could have been parents years ago." The weight of this discovery settled on him visibly, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been physically struck. 23 letters, David," I said quietly. 23 children who needed homes, while we were spending our life savings trying to create a biological child who was never meant to exist. The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "Why didn't you send them?" David asked, though I think he already knew the answer. "Because I loved you more than I wanted to be a mother," I said simply, watching him flinch at the truth. Every year, I'd write another letter, imagining the child who might need us. But then I'd remember how adamant you were about wanting biological children, and I'd put the letter away. I chose our marriage over my maternal instincts every single time. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where other families had thrived while we'd struggled. I could have been a mother, David. We could have given love to children who desperately needed it. But I respected your wishes because I thought our marriage was strong enough to survive anything. The silence that followed was heavy with 20 years of missed opportunities and sacrificed dreams. David's composure finally cracked completely. He fell to his knees among the scattered adoption letters, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "What have I done?" he kept repeating. "What have I done to us? To you? To all these children who needed homes?" I watched this broken man, my former husband, confront the full magnitude of his choices. "You sacrificed everything for me, and I threw it away for a woman who couldn't love me a fraction of how much you did." His words were muffled by tears and self-recrimination. "I'm a fool, Margaret. A selfish, blind fool who destroyed the most precious thing in his life because he was too stupid to recognize what real love looked like." Part of me wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain the way I always had. But part of me needed him to fully understand the weight of what we'd both lost. Looking at David, surrounded by the evidence of dreams I'd sacrificed for our marriage, I felt something shift in my heart. The anger I'd carried for 20 years began to transform into something else. Not romantic love, but the kind of forgiveness that only comes through years of prayer and spiritual growth. "David," I said softly, kneeling beside him on the floor among the letters. "Look at me." When his tear-filled eyes met mine, I saw not the selfish man who'd abandoned me, but a broken human being who'd spent 2 decades learning the hardest lessons life could teach. "I forgive you," I said simply, and watched as the words hit him like a physical force. "I forgave you years ago, actually. Carrying that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you." His sobs intensified, but now they seemed to carry relief along with the grief. "You don't deserve my forgiveness," he whispered. "No," I agreed gently, "but that's what makes it grace." Over the next several hours, David and I talked in ways we hadn't in the final years of our marriage. He told me about his treatment, his loneliness, his regret. I share my journey of healing, my teaching career, my work with foster children. "You became everything I always knew you could be," he said quietly. "Strong, independent, purposeful. You didn't need me to become the woman God intended you to be." There was no bitterness in his voice, only genuine admiration mixed with sadness for lost opportunities. "I needed to lose you to find myself," I admitted. As painful as it was, I discovered who Margaret Thompson really was when she wasn't trying to be half of David and Margaret. We were different people now, older, wiser, scarred by life, but somehow more authentic than we'd ever been together. "Margaret," David said as the sun began to set through our living room windows, "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need help. Not just physically, though the cancer treatments left me weak. I need help becoming the man I should have been 20 years ago." His request was so humble, so different from the demanding man who'd once insisted on biological children at any cost. "I'm not asking you to take me back. I know that ships sailed long ago. But I'm asking for your guidance as I try to figure out how to live the rest of my life with integrity." I studied his face, seeing genuine humility where once there had been stubborn pride. "What kind of help?" I asked carefully. "Help me learn how to love without conditions. Help me understand what real commitment means. Help me become someone worthy of redemption. I can help you heal, David, but not as your wife," I said gently but firmly. "Those romantic feelings died a long time ago, and I won't pretend they can be resurrected. But as your friend, as someone who once loved you deeply, I can help you find your way back to being a decent man." Relief washed over his face. Not disappointment, but genuine gratitude that I was willing to help at all. "I don't want to be your husband again, Margaret. I want to learn how to be the friend I should have been, the supporter I should have been, the man who put someone else's needs before his own desires." His words felt genuine, tempered by years of hard-earned wisdom. "Then we could try," I said. "One day at a time. with clear boundaries and honest communication. David's recovery from cancer was slower than expected, and I found myself in the strange position of caring for the man who'd once abandoned me when I needed him most. But something had fundamentally changed in both of us. Where he'd once been impatient and demanding, he was now grateful for the smallest kindnesses. "You don't have to do this," he'd say when I brought him soup or drove him to medical appointments. "I know I don't have to," I'd reply. "I'm choosing to." The difference between obligation and choice, between conditional and unconditional love, became the foundation of our rebuilt relationship. I wasn't caring for him out of romantic love or marital duty, but out of the kind of Christian compassion that sees humanity in even those who've hurt us. 3 months into David's recovery, something beautiful began to emerge from our newfound friendship. "Margaret," he said one evening as I was closing my laptop after researching adoption agencies, "would you tell me about the children you want to adopt? I mean, really tell me. Not what you think I want to hear, but what your heart says." For the first time in our entire relationship, I felt safe sharing my deepest maternal longings with him. "There's an 8-year-old girl named Emma at the agency downtown," I began tentatively. "She's been in foster care for 3 years, and she loves to read. She reminds me of myself at that age, quiet, observant, hungry for someone to believe in her." David listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about Emma's background and needs. "She sounds perfect for you," he said sincerely. "Tell me more about what the adoption process looks like." When I mentioned that single-parent adoptions were more challenging and expensive, David surprised me with an offer I never expected. "What if I helped?" he asked quietly. "Not as your husband or romantic partner, but as someone who wants to make amends for all the children we could have loved together." I stared at him, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "I have money from the divorce settlement, Margaret. Sarah took a lot, but she didn't get everything. Let me use what I have to help you adopt Emma. Let me do something good with the resources I wasted on selfish pursuits for so many years." His offer was both generous and complicated, but I could see the genuine desire for redemption in his eyes. "We'd have to be very clear about boundaries and expectations," I said carefully. "Of course, this would be your child, your decision, your family. I'd just be a friend who helped make it possible." The first time I met Emma at the adoption agency, David came with me for moral support, not as a potential father, but as a friend who understood how much this moment meant to me. Emma was smaller than I'd expected, with serious brown eyes that held too much knowledge for her 8 years. "Are you going to be my mom?" she asked directly, the kind of question that cuts straight to the heart. "I'd like to be," I said honestly. "If you'd like me to be." She studied my face carefully, then looked at David. "Who's he?" "This is my friend David. He's helping me get ready to be the best mom I can be for you." Emma nodded solemnly. "My last mom said she wanted me, but then she changed her mind." "Are you going to change your mind?" The pain in her question broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. "Emma, I've been waiting my whole life to be someone's mother. I will never, ever change my mind about wanting you." 6 months later, Emma moved into what had once been our spare bedroom, now transformed into a little girl's sanctuary with purple walls, bookshelves filled with stories, and a reading nook by the window. "This is really mine?" she asked, touching the soft comforter with wonder. "Really yours," I confirmed, watching her face light up with joy I'd waited decades to witness. David had helped financially with the adoption and emotionally with my preparation, but he maintained careful boundaries, never overstepping his role as supportive friend. "Can we read a story?" Emma asked, already settling into the reading chair with a book in her lap. As I sat beside her, beginning the first of what would be thousands of bedtime stories, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. This was the motherhood I was meant for, not creating life, but nurturing it, not biological connection, but chosen love. David, now healthy and living in his own apartment across town, often came for Sunday dinners. He'd watch Emma and me reading together or working on school projects, and I'd catch a look of profound peace on his face. "You were right all along," he told me one evening as Emma played in her room. "Love makes a family, not genetics. Emma is your daughter in every way that matters, and watching you two together, It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. There was no jealousy in his voice, no regret about being excluded from our little family unit. Just genuine happiness for the woman he'd once loved and the child who'd completed her in ways he never could. "Thank you," I said simply, "for helping me get here, for learning how to be a real friend, for showing me what redemption looks like." He smiled, older and wiser than the man who'd left me 20 years ago. "Thank you for teaching me what unconditional love actually means." 2 years after Emma's adoption, our unconventional family had found its rhythm. Emma called David Uncle David and looked forward to his Sunday visits, where he'd help with homework and share stories from his childhood. He'd learned to love without possession, to support without controlling, to be present without demanding center stage. "Mom," Emma said one evening as we prepared dinner for David's visit, "Uncle David makes you happy, but different than I do." I smiled at her 8-year-old wisdom. "How so, sweetheart?" "I make you happy like a daughter makes her mom happy. Uncle David makes you happy like a friend who's sorry and wants to be better." Out of the mouths of babes. That's exactly right, Emma. Some people come into our lives as family, some as friends, and sometimes people who hurt us can learn to become people who help us heal. As David arrived with flowers for both Emma and me, I realized that while our story hadn't ended the way I'd once dreamed, it had become something even more beautiful, a testament to forgiveness, growth, and the many different ways love can transform lives. I hope this story touched your heart and reminded you that sometimes our greatest disappointments redirect us toward our greatest blessings. Where are you watching from today? Share in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring tales that prove love, forgiveness, and family come in many beautiful forms.